The machine that remembered the corridors of Threshold Station stretched endlessly into darkness. Cold and silent, like the belly of some great beast that had swallowed the stars themselves, Unit KV-7742 stood at his post as he had stood for 18 years. His metal feet locked to the floor plates, his optical sensors scanning the passage ahead with mechanical precision. The other guards called him Kova. Though he did not remember choosing that name or any name at all, he was a cyborg. One of 10,000 machines built from the bodies of criminals and rebels and prisoners of war. The hegemony had taken his memories, scraped his mind clean like rust from old steel, and filled the empty space with programming that demanded only one thing: absolute obedience for 18 years. Kova had never questioned his purpose. He had never wondered about the life he might have lived before they made him into this thing of metal and wire. He had never felt curious or sad or angry or afraid. He simply existed. A tool waiting to be used, a weapon that would never rust because it had forgotten how to feel the Dominion. Prison orbited a dead star at the edge of known space, and its gravity well made escape. Impossible. 300 guards patrolled its halls automated. Defense systems watched every corner. A fleet of interceptors circled endlessly in the void outside. No prisoner had ever escaped from Threshold Station, and no prisoner ever would. That was what Kova believed until the night they brought in the girl. She was small and thin, perhaps 12 years old by human counting, with dark hair matted with dirt and eyes that seemed too large for her face. Two Dominion officers dragged her between them like she weighed nothing at all, her bare feet scraping against the metal floor. Kova watched them approach, his sensors automatically cataloging her vital signs: elevated heart rate, mild dehydration, multiple contusions on her arms and legs. She was human, one of the conquered species that the hegemony had been systematically stripping of resources and freedom for the past century. Her planet was called Kepler 7b, a small world rich in water that the Dominion wanted. For its mining operations, the humans there had refused to surrender their only source of lives, so the hegemony had made an example of them. Processing bay, the lead officer said as they passed Kova, his voice dripping with contempt. This one is scheduled for neural harvest in 72 hours. Neural harvest. Kova knew what those words meant. The Dominion would cut open her skull, extract her cerebral cortex, and use the biological material to fuel their psionic weapons program. It was efficient and practical and completely without mercy. The girl would cease to exist. Her memories and dreams and hopes dissolved into nothing more than fuel for machines of war. This should not have bothered. Kova's programming contained no protocols for compassion, or pity, or moral judgment. He was supposed to watch the officers drag her past and then return to his scanning routines as if nothing had happened. But the girl looked up at him as she passed, and something strange occurred. She did not look at him with fear or hatred or despair. Instead, she studied his face with a kind of quiet recognition, as if she could see something beneath the chrome plating and the glowing optical sensors. "You have kind eyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the station systems. "Even if they made you forget." The words hit Kova like a physical blow. Something deep inside his programming stuttered and sparked, and for one terrible moment, he felt a sensation he could not identify. It was like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for decades, letting in light that burned and healed at the same time. Memory surfaced from somewhere it should not have existed. Saw a small girl with dark hair reaching up to him, her hands tiny and warm against his skin. He heard a voice, his own voice, saying a name that made his chest ache with longing. Myra. His daughter's name had been Myra. Though officers dragged the girl around a corner and out of sight, but Kova remained frozen at his post, his systems flooding with errors and warnings. This was impossible. His memories had been erased, burned away by Dominion neural scrubbing technology that left nothing behind. He should not be able to remember anything from before his conversion. But the girl's words had unlocked something that the scrubbing had missed. A single ember of humanity buried so deep that even the hegemony's machines could not find it over the next several hours. Kova accessed the station's security feeds and learned everything he could about the girl. Her name was Ilara, and she was the last survivor of a village called New Haven on Kepler 7b. Her parents had been killed in the initial assault. Her siblings had been taken for labor conscription. She alone had been selected for neural harvest because her brain showed unusual psionic potential in 72 hours. Ilara would die screaming on a surgical table while Dominion technicians carved out her mind. Kova's programming told him this was acceptable. The hegemony's needs came before the needs of any individual, especially a human, but something else inside him, something older and deeper than any programming, rejected this conclusion with absolute fury. He had been a man once. He had held his daughter in his arms and promised to protect her from anything that might hurt her. Hegemony had taken that man and turned him into a monster. But they had not destroyed him completely. A single spark remained, and Ilara's words had fanned it into flame for the first time in 18 years. Kova made a decision that was entirely his own. He would save the girl. He would break her out of Threshold Station, escape the inescapable prison, and deliver her somewhere the Dominion could never find her. His programming screamed at him that this was treason, that he would be hunted and destroyed, that the mathematical probability of success was so low as to be essentially zero. But Kova was no longer listening to his programming. He was listening to something far more powerful, something that the hegemony in all their technological brilliance had never understood. He was listening to his heart. The escape would have to be perfect. He had 72 hours to plan and execute the most audacious prison break in the history of the Dominion. He had no allies, no weapons beyond his standard issue equipment, and no margin for error, but he had something the hegemony had never anticipated. He had 18 years of detailed knowledge about every system, every patrol route, every weakness in the station's defenses, and he had a reason to fight that no amount of programming could overcome. He had remembered what it meant to love Kova, began to plan, and somewhere deep in his mechanical chest, the ember of his humanity burned brighter than it had in nearly 2 decades. The machine was waking up, and when it finished waking, the hegemony would learn exactly how dangerous a single act of compassion could become. The breaking of chain. Kova moved through the station like a ghost in the hours that followed, his every step calculated to avoid detection. He had spent 18 years learning the rhythms of Threshold Station, the rotation of guard patrols, the blind spots in the sensor grid, the moments when automated systems cycled through maintenance routines. Now, he used that knowledge against the masters who had created him. The first challenge was disabling the tracking chip embedded in his skull. Every cyborg unit carried one, a small device that broadcast location data to the central command network every 30 seconds. If Kova tried to leave his assigned patrol sector without authorization, alarms would sound across the entire station. He found an access terminal in a maintenance corridor and connected his neural interface to the system. His fingers moved across the controls with a phone face to the controls with a system. His fingers moved across the controls with a Kensburg with a Kensburg. A first to the system. The system has the speed and precision that surprised even him, calling up schematics and security protocols he should not have been able to access. But Kova had discovered something interesting about his programming during his 18 years of service. The hegemony had designed their cyborg soldiers to be obedient, not stupid. They needed guards who could think independently, solve problems, and adapt to unexpected situations. This meant leaving certain cognitive functions intact, including the ability to learn and remember. Kova had learned a great deal over the years. quietly observing and cataloging information that his programming deemed irrelevant. He knew the access codes for security systems that officers thought were secret. He knew the names and habits of every guard on the station. He knew which maintenance shafts connected to which corridors, and which doors could be opened without triggering alarms. He used this knowledge now, rewriting his tracking chips. BRO a DCIST signal to show him standing motionless at his regular post while his actual body moved freely through restricted areas. The second challenge was acquiring weapons. Kova's standard equipment included only a shock baton and a communications device, neither of which would be sufficient for what he planned. He made his way to an armory on the station's lower level, timing his approach to coincide with a shift change when the guards would be distracted. The door required a retinal scan and a voice authorization. Anka had neither, but he did have access to the station's personnel files. Found a junior officer named Torvik, who was currently sleeping in his quarters after a double shift using the maintenance network. Kova accessed the environmental controls in Torvik's room and pumped in a mild sedative gas to ensure the officer would not wake. Then he entered the room, used Torvik's unconscious eye for the retinal scan, and recorded a sample of his voice for the authorization. The armory door slid open, revealing racks of plasma rifles, fragmentation grenades, and combat armor. Kova selected his weapons carefully, taking only what he could conceal beneath his standard uniform: a compact plasma pistol for close quarters, a neural disruptor for dealing with other cyborgs, and a set of magnetic charges for breaching sealed doors. He was ready to proceed to the third challenge, the most difficult of all: reaching Alara without raising an alarm. The girl was being held in a high-security cell block on the station's upper level, guarded by a rotating team of 4 cyborg units and monitored by a dedicated sensor array. Direct approach was impossible. Kova would have to find another way. He spent 6 hours studying the station's infrastructure, tracing power conduits and ventilation shafts through the maze of corridors and compartments. Finally, he found what he was looking for: an old emergency access tunnel that ran directly beneath the high-security block. The tunnel had been sealed decades ago after a containment breach, its entrance buried behind layers of welded metal and warning signs, but the tunnel itself was still intact, and it connected to a service hatch in the floor of the cell block's central corridor. Kova used his magnetic charges to cut through the sealed entrance, working slowly and carefully to avoid triggering any vibration sensors. The tunnel beyond was dark and cramped, filled with dust and the bones of small creatures that had wandered in and died. He crawled through the darkness for what felt like hours, his optical sensors switching to low-light mode to navigate the twisting passage. When he reached the service hatch, he paused to scan the corridor above. 2 guards stood at the far end, their backs turned as they discussed something in low voices. A third guard was making rounds, currently 3 corridors away according to the patrol schedule Kova had memorized. The 4th guard was stationed directly outside Alara's cell. Kova waited until the patrolling guard's route took him to the opposite side of the block, then pushed open the hatch and climbed silently into the corridor. The guard outside Alara's cell turned at the sound, his optical sensors locking onto Kova with recognition. Unit KV-7742, the guard said, his voice flat and mechanical. You are not authorized for this sector. State your purpose. Kova did not hesitate. He raised a neural disruptor and fired, sending a pulse of electromagnetic energy directly into the other cyborg's processing core. Guard collapsed without a sound, his systems temporarily scrambled by the weapon's effects. Kova caught him before he hit the floor and lowered him gently, then turned to the cell door. The lock required a command-level authorization that Kova did not possess, but the magnetic charges solved the problem quickly enough. The door slid open with a hiss of escaping air, and Kova stepped inside to find Alara huddled in the corner of the cell, her eyes wide with fear. "It is me," Kova said, keeping his voice low, "the guard from the corridor. Do you remember?" Alara stared at him for a long moment, and then her face transformed with recognition, the one with kind eyes. She whispered, "You came back. I came to get you out of here," Kova said, extending his hand. "But we have to move quickly. The other guards will notice something is wrong very soon." Alara took his hand without hesitation, her small fingers wrapping around his metal palm with surprising strength together. They slipped out of the cell and into the corridor, moving as quickly as silence would allow. The two guards at the far end had not noticed anything yet, but that would change in seconds. Kova led Alara to a maintenance shaft he had identified during his planning, a narrow passage that would take them down to the hangar level without passing any checkpoints. They climbed into the shaft and began to descend, the metal rungs cold against their hands. Halfway down, the station's alarm system activated, filling the air with a piercing wail that made Alara cry out in fear. Kova pulled her close, shielding her with his body as they continued their descent. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I will not let them take you." They reached the hangar level just as a squad of cyborg guards rounded the corner behind them, their weapons raised and ready to fire. Kova pushed Alara behind a stack of cargo containers and turned to face the attackers, his plasma pistol humming with deadly energy. He had been one of them once, a machine without memory or feeling or purpose beyond obedience. Now he would fight them with everything he had, and he would win or he would die trying. The first guard fell with a hole burned through his chest. The second and third went down moments later, their bodies crumpling to the deck as Kova's aim proved as deadly as his resolve. He felt nothing as he killed them. No guilt or sorrow or satisfaction. They were not his enemies. Not really. They were victims, just as he had been. Their humanity stolen and replaced with cold circuitry, but he could not save them. Not now, not yet. He could only save Alara, and that would have to be enough. The last guard charged at him with a shock baton, and Kova met the attack with his bare hands, catching the weapon and wrenching it away before driving his fist into the guard's optical sensors. The guard collapsed, sparking and twitching, and Kova turned to find Alara watching him with an expression he could not read. "Come," he said, holding out his hand once more. "There's a ship waiting for us." The ship was the Meridian's Hope, an old human-designed transport that the Dominion had captured years ago and kept as a trophy. Kova had chosen it deliberately, not just because it was fast and reliable, but because he remembered it. He had helped build ships like this one, back when he was a man named Alexander Volkov, back when he had a family and a future and a reason to hope. The memories were still fragmentary and painful, but they grew clearer with every passing hour. Like a picture emerging slowly from static, Kova sealed the ship's hatch behind them and ran to the cockpit, his hands moving across the controls with a familiarity that felt like coming. Home interceptors were already launching from the station's base, their engines screaming as they moved to cut off his escape. The gravity well of the dead star pulled at the ship, trying to drag it back into the station's orbit. But Alexander Volkov had been one of the best engineers in the colonial fleet, and he had designed emergency escape protocols for exactly this kind of situation. He punched in a sequence that the Dominion had never thought to delete, and the Meridian's Hope roared with sudden power as its emergency thrusters ignited. The ship shot forward like a bullet from a gun, blasting past the interceptors before they could react and punching through the gravity, while, with a shudder that rattled every plate in the hull behind them, Threshold Station grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the stars. Alara pressed her face to the viewport, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the prison disappear. "Where will we go?" she asked. Kova looked at her, And for the first time in 18 years, he smiled. Somewhere they will never find us, he said. Somewhere we can be free. The Meridian's hope sailed into the darkness between stars, carrying a broken machine and a brave little girl toward a future that neither of them could imagine behind them. The hegemony burned with fury ahead of them. The universe waited with open arms. The kindling of rebellion 3 months passed in the cold silence between Starskova and Alara ran from system to system, never staying in one place longer than a few days. Always moving, always watching for signs of pursuit. The hegemony had placed the largest bounty in their history on Kova's head. Enough credits to buy a small moon or fund a private army for a decade. Every bounty hunter, mercenary, and opportunist in 12 systems was searching for them. But Kova had learned to hide well during his years as a prison guard, and he used every trick he knew to keep them one step ahead of their hunters. They traveled through asteroid fields where sensor signals scattered into meaningless noise. They landed on abandoned moons and dead worlds where no one thought to look. They traded the Meridian's hope for a smaller, less recognizable vessel, and then traded that vessel for another, leaving a trail of false leads and dead ends behind. Alara grew stronger during those months of running, her body filling out with proper food and rest, her eyes losing some of the haunted look they had carried since her capture. She asked Kova endless questions about the galaxy, about the hegemony, about the life he had lived before they made him into a machine. He answered as best he could, his memories still fragmentary, but growing clearer each day. He told her about Alexander Volkov, the engineer who had built starships and dreamed of exploring the universe. He told her about his wife, a woman named Katya, whose face he could almost remember. Now he told her about Myra, his daughter, who had been about Alara's age when the hegemony came for their world. What happened to them? Alara asked one night as they drifted through an empty sector, the stars blazing cold and bright beyond the viewport. Kova was silent for a long moment before answering. I do not know, he admitted. The scrubbing took most of those memories away. All I have are fragments and feelings. I remember fear and pain, and then nothing until I woke up in a processing center with a number instead of a name. Maybe they escaped, Alara said hopefully. Maybe they are out there somewhere, looking for you. Kova did not answer, but something in his chest ached at the thought he had accepted long ago that his family was probably dead, casualties of the hegemony's conquest like so many billions of others. But a tiny part of him, the part that had woken up when Alara spoke to him in that corridor, could not stop hoping. The first contact from the resistance came during their 4th month of running. They had landed on a small trading post at the edge of civilized space, a collection of docking bays and merchant stalls clinging to a barren rock. Ova was negotiating for supplies when a woman approached him, her face scarred and her eyes hard with years of fighting. You are KV-7742, she said quietly, her hand resting on the weapon at her hip. The cyborg who broke out of Threshold Station. Kova's combat protocols activated instantly, his body tensing for violence, but the woman held up her other hand in a gesture of peace. Easy, she said. I am not here to collect the bounty. I am here to offer you something better. Her name was Yuki Tanaka, and she was the captain of a resistance cell that had been fighting the hegemony for 10 years. They called themselves the Iron Wake, a small fleet of salvage ships crewed by escaped slaves, former soldiers, and refugees from conquered worlds. They had heard the story of Kova's escape, spread through whispered communications and underground networks until it had become something like a legend. A cyborg guard had turned against his programming. A machine had remembered how to be human, and he had done it all to save a single child. People need hope, Captain Tanaka told Kova as they sat in a private room above the trading post. The hegemony has been crushing us for generations. They have better ships, better weapons, better everything. We cannot beat them with force alone. Then how do you intend to beat them at all? Kova asked. Tanaka smiled grimly, by showing people that the hegemony is not invincible, that their perfect soldiers can be turned, that their unbreakable prisons can be broken. Your escape has done more for the resistance in 3 months than 10 years of fighting. You have given people something to believe in. Kova looked at Alara, who was eating a meal at a nearby table. Her attention focused on a datapad showing star charts and navigation routes. She had become skilled at reading them during their months of running, her quick mind absorbing information like a sponge. I did not do it for the resistance, Kova said. I did it for her. I know, Tanaka replied. That is what makes it so powerful. You did not break your programming because someone ordered you to or because you calculated. It was strategically advantageous. You broke it because you cared about a child you had never met, because something inside you refused to let her die. That is the most human thing I have ever heard. Over the following weeks, more people found their way to Kova, and Elara Declan Cross came first. A massive man whose body was covered in scars from the compliance chip he had cut out of his own neck with a kitchen knife. He had been a slave soldier for the hegemony before his escape, forced to fight against his own people until the day he decided death was better than continued servitude. He had survived against all odds, and now he wanted to make the hegemony pay. Then came the crew of the Achilles, a fast attack ship that specialized in raiding Dominion supply convoys. Their captain was a young man named Marcus Webb, whose entire family had been killed during the conquest of Earth's colonies. He fought with a cold fury that sometimes frightened even his own crew. But he was absolutely loyal to anyone who shared his hatred of the hegemony. Others followed in a steady stream. Refugees, escaped prisoners, former collaborators who had finally found the courage to resist. They gathered around Kova, not because he asked them to, but because they needed someone to follow, someone who represented everything they wanted to believe about themselves. Kova never wanted to be a leader. He had been content to run and hide, to find some quiet corner of the galaxy where he and Alara could live in peace. But the hegemony made that impossible when they learned of his connection to the resistance in retaliation for his escape. They sent a fleet to Kepler 7b and burned Alara's homeworld to ash. Every city, every village, every trace of human civilization was reduced to smoking rubble. The news reached Kova through resistance channels, and he sat alone in his quarters for a long time afterward, his mechanical systems humming softly in the darkness. Alara found him there, her eyes red from crying, but her voice steady. They killed everyone, she said. Everyone I ever knew. My teachers and my friends and the people who tried to hide me when the soldiers came. They are all gone. Kova looked at her, and something shifted inside him. He had been running for months, trying to escape a fight that he knew he could not win. But there was no escape. Not really. The hegemony would keep hunting them until they were caught or killed. They would keep burning worlds and harvesting mines and crushing anyone who dared to resist. Running would not stop them. Only fighting would. I am sorry, Kova said, his voice rough with emotion. He was still learning to feel. I am sorry. I could not save them. You saved me, Alara replied. Now save everyone else. Kova stood up and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars that stretched endlessly in every direction. Somewhere out there, the hegemony was celebrating their victory, confident that they had taught the resistance a lesson it would never forget. They were wrong. Captain Tanaka, Kova said into his communicator, call a meeting of all cell leaders. It is time to stop running and start fighting. The resistance gathered in the cargo bay of their largest ship. Nearly 200 fighters from a dozen different cells. They looked at Kova with eyes full of hope and fear and desperate determination. He was not their leader. Not yet, but he was the closest thing they had to a symbol. The hegemony thinks we are weak, Kova told them, his voice echoing through the bay. They think our compassion is a vulnerability. that our feelings make us lesser beings. They are wrong. I know because for 18 years I was their perfect soldier, empty and obedient and dead inside. And then a little girl reminded me what it meant to be alive. He looked at Alara, standing at the front of the crowd, her small face fierce with anger and grief. Compassion is not weakness, he continued. It is the only thing that makes us real. It is the reason we fight, the reason we refuse to surrender, the reason we would rather die free than live as slaves. The hegemony will never understand this because they have forgotten what it means to be human. But we remember, and we will remind them. The resistance cheered, a sound that shook the walls of the cargo bay and echoed out into the void. The war was beginning, and Kova, the machine that had learned to feel, would lead them into the fire. But the humans kept coming, pressing forward through the fire with the stubborn determination that had defined their species since they first crawled out of the oceans of their homeworld. They broke through the first defensive line, then the second, then the third. Each victory cost them dearly, but each victory brought them closer to the station's Korakova's ship was hit during the final approach. A plasma bolt tearing through the hull and sending him tumbling through a corridor filled with fire and debris. His body was damaged badly. One arm completely severed, half his optical sensors destroyed. Systems failing across the board, but he dragged himself to his feet and kept moving, kept fighting. Because he had not come this far to die in a hallway. Reached the station's command center. Just as Alara's squadron blasted through the main hangar doors, she found him there, standing over the bodies of 4 elite Dominion guards he had killed with his bare hands, his remaining arms sparking with exposed circuitry. "You look terrible," she said, a voice catching with emotion despite her attempt at humor. "I have looked worse," Kova replied, though he could not actually remember a time when that was true together. They walked to the command console where the Dominion's high command had gathered. Old men and women in elegant uniforms who had ruled the hegemony with absolute power for generations. They looked at Kova with a mixture of fear and disbelief, unable to understand how a broken machine and a handful of rebels had brought their empire to its knees. "It is over," Kova told them. "Your fleet is destroyed. Your armies are scattered. Your cyborg soldiers are waking up all across the galaxy. Surrender now, and we will show you the mercy you never showed us." The Dominion's Supreme Admiral, a gaunt man with cold eyes and a face like carved stone, laughed bitterly. "Mercy," he spat. "You think this changes anything? You have destroyed us, but something else will rise to take our place. The strong will always dominate the weak. It is the natural order of the universe." Kova looked at Alara, at the fierce young woman who had once been a terrified child in a prison cell, and then back at the Admiral. "You are wrong," he said. "The strong do not dominate. They protect. They lift up those who cannot lift themselves. They build instead of destroy. You never understood that because you were never really strong. You were just bullies with better weapons." He turned to his soldiers. "Take them into custody, and make sure they are treated humanely. We are not like them. We will never be like them." The war was over. The hegemony had fallen, and somewhere in the wreckage of Threshold Station, a broken machine allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in a very long time: hope. But the humans kept coming, pressing forward through the fire with the stubborn determination that had defined their species since they first crawled out of the oceans of their homeworld. They broke through the first defensive line, then the second, then the third. Each victory cost them dearly, but each victory brought them closer to the station's Korakova's ship was hit during the final approach. A plasma bolt tearing through the hull and sending him tumbling through a corridor filled with fire and debris. His body was damaged badly. One arm completely severed, half his optical sensors destroyed. Systems failing across the board, but he dragged himself to his feet and kept moving, kept fighting. Because he had not come this far to die in a hallway. reached the station's command center. Just as Alara's squadron blasted through the main hangar doors, she found him there, standing over the bodies of 4 elite Dominion guards he had killed with his bare hands, his remaining arms sparking with exposed circuitry. "You look terrible," she said, a voice catching with emotion despite her attempt at humor. "I have looked worse," Kova replied, though he could not actually remember a time when that was true together. They walked to the command console where the Dominion's high command had gathered. Old men and women in elegant uniforms who had ruled the hegemony with absolute power for generations. They looked at Kova with a mixture of fear and disbelief, unable to understand how a broken machine and a handful of rebels had brought their empire to its knees. "It is over," Kova told them. "Your fleet is destroyed. Your armies are scattered. Your cyborg soldiers are waking up all across the galaxy. Surrender now, and we will show you the mercy you never showed us." The Dominion's Supreme Admiral, a gaunt man with cold eyes and a face like carved stone, laughed bitterly. "Mercy," he spat. "You think this changes anything? You have destroyed us, but something else will rise to take our place. The strong will always dominate the weak. It is the natural order of the universe." Kova looked at Alara, at the fierce young woman who had once been a terrified child in a prison cell, and then back at the Admiral. "You are wrong," he said. "The strong do not dominate. They protect. They lift up those who cannot lift themselves. They build instead of destroy. You never understood that because you were never really strong. You were just bullies with better weapons." He turned to his soldiers. "Take them into custody and make sure they are treated humanely. We are not like them. We will never be like them." The war was over. The hegemony had fallen, and somewhere in the wreckage of Threshold Station, a broken machine allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in a very long time: hope. The Supreme Star Commander of the hegemony did not die quickly. For months after the fall of Threshold Station, remnants of the Dominion's forces continued to fight in scattered pockets across the galaxy. Warlords carved out small empires from the chaos. Opportunists tried to fill the power vacuum, and millions of displaced people wandered between systems looking for somewhere to call home. The resistance, which had been built for war, suddenly found itself responsible for peace. It was a challenge that proved harder than any battle they had ever fought. Kova spent the first year after the war's end traveling from system to system, negotiating treaties, mediating disputes, and trying to prevent the galaxy from collapsing into anarchy. His reputation preceded him everywhere he went. The cyborg, who had broken his programming. The machine that had remembered how to be human. The commander who had brought down an empire. People trusted him in a way they trusted few others, because he had proven that he cared about more than power or revenge. Alara traveled with him during those difficult months, serving as his aide and advisor, and sometimes his conscience. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, wise beyond her years, tempered by war, but not hardened by it. She still believed in compassion and mercy, still insisted that their victory meant nothing if they became as cruel as those they had defeated. "You need to rest," she told Kova one evening as their ship orbited a world that had just agreed to join the growing coalition of free systems. "Your systems are failing. The medical teams keep warning you that you are pushing too hard." Kova looked down at his body, the patchwork of original parts and field repairs that had kept him functional through 7 years of fighting. He had been rebuilt so many times that barely any of his fullest original form remained. Just fragments of the machine the hegemony had created and the man that machine had once been. "There is too much work to do," he said. "The people need leadership, stability, someone they can believe in. The people need you alive." Alara replied firmly, "What happens to everything we have built if you collapse in the middle of a negotiation? What happens to the movement if its symbol burns himself out before the work is finished?" She was right. Of course, she usually Veskova agreed to return to the main fleet for repairs. And while the medical teams worked on his damaged systems, he watched the news feeds showing the progress of reconstruction across the galaxy former. Hegemony worlds were holding their first free election cyborgs, who had been awakened by the liberation codes, were building new communities where they could learn to be human. Again, children were being born into a universe without the Dominion's shadow hanging over them. It was everything Kova had fought for. And yet he felt strangely empty. The war had given him purpose. A clear enemy to fight and a simple goal to pursue. Peace was more complicated. He did not know what he was supposed to do now that the fighting was over. The answer came during the first Congress of Free Systems, a gathering of representatives from every world that had joined the coalition. They met in a great hall on a neutral station. Hundreds of delegates arguing and debating and trying to build something that had never existed before. A government founded on the principle that every mind was sacred and no being could own another. The debates went on for weeks, contentious and exhausting, with factions forming and dissolving and reforming as different groups pushed their own agenda. Skova watched from the sidelines, offering advice when asked but trying not to impose his will on the proceedings. This was their government to build, not his. But on the final day of the Congress, a delegate from one of the outer colonies stood up and made a motion that changed everything. We have spent weeks arguing about the structure of our government, the delegate said. We have debated representation and voting rights and economic policy until we are all exhausted. But we have avoided the most important question of all. Who will lead us? A murmur went through the hall. Everyone knew what was coming. I proposed that Alexander Volkov, the commander who led us to victory, be named Supreme Star Commander of the Stellar Commonwealth, the delegate continued. Not as a dictator or a king, but as a symbol of what we stand for, a reminder that compassion and courage can triumph over tyranny. A leader who has proven that he serves the people rather than himself. The motion was seconded immediately, then thirded, then supported by voice after voice until the hall rang with agreement. Kova stood frozen in his seat, his processors struggling to comprehend what was happening. He had never wanted power. He had never asked to lead anyone. He had only wanted to save one little girl from a terrible fate. But the Congress was not asking for his permission. They were asking for his service. Ilara found him afterward, standing alone on an observation deck, looking out at the stars. You are going to refuse, she said. It was not a question. I should, Kova replied. I am not qualified for this. I am a soldier, not a statesman. I am held together with salvaged parts and stubbornness. I do not know anything about running a government. Neither does anyone else. Ilara pointed out. We are all making this up as we go. The difference is that people trust you. They believe in you. They need you. Why? Kova asked. The question he had been avoiding for years finally forcing its way out. I did not break my programming because I was special. I broke it because you spoke to me in a corridor and something inside me responded. It could have happened to anyone. Ilara smiled. The same smile she had given him all those years ago in the darkness of Threshold Station. That is exactly why you should lead, she said. You did not break your programming because you were special. You broke it because somewhere inside you never stopped being human. That is what we need. Not a perfect leader. A human one. She took his hand, her fingers warm against his cold metal.